Coming up on this special lens episode of Photography Online. We show you how to deal with flare, we see how far lenses have come in the past 50 years, and we look at the control a tilt-shift lens offers. Welcome to another commercial-free episode of Photography Online and a special lens-themed show. Now, lenses are probably the most important part of any camera kit, regardless of what format and medium you shoot. We'll be looking at all the options throughout the show and also showing you how you can get the best from any lens, regardless of how good it is. Before all that though, here's a quick photography question just for fun. Which of these exposures would give the brightest image at ISO 100? A, 1/60th at f/16, B, 1/30th at f/8, C, 1/500th at f/1.4, or D, 1/250th at f/5.6. I'll give you the answer later in the show. So let's get things underway with a look at how to control one of the most common lens problems, flare. If you're shooting into the light, then this can often be a problem. So here's Nick to give us a few tricks.
As photographers, we're usually looking for good light. More often than not, especially for landscape photographers, this is sunlight. However, sunlight can cause a few issues, with one of these being lens flare.
There are a couple of types of lens flare. Specular lens flare is what we probably imagine when we think of flare. This is not always a bad thing, and believe it or not, many photographers and filmmakers actually add false flare in post. However, specular flare can ruin a shot when it is not desired or intended, so knowing how to control this can be a useful skill to have. The other kind of flare is ghost flare. Yeah, okay, I just made that name up, but it describes the effect perfectly. Ghost flare is where you have excessive light bouncing around inside the lens, which causes a loss of contrast in some or all areas of the image.
One thing to understand is that lens flare will only happen if you're shooting into the light. If the sun is to the side of you or behind of you, then this won't cause any problems. But if the sun is shining onto your lens, then you will have lens flare to some degree, even if it's too subtle to notice.
So what can we do to eliminate or reduce flare in our shots when it is not wanted?
The best and easiest way by far is to simply shield the lens by casting a shadow over it as you take a photo.
This can be done with a hat, a filter case, or even your hand or your head. This is easier if you're using a tripod, as you can come round to the front of the camera and see where the shadow is falling. You want it just covering the front element of the lens. If you go too close, then you might run the risk of encroaching into the frame, especially when using a wide-angle lens, so pay attention to this.
If you hand hold the camera, then it's a little more difficult, yet no major problem.
Simply use your free hand to shield the sun from the lens. As you won't be able to see the shadow, look through the viewfinder and move your hand into the shot until you can just see it at the edge of the frame. Then, move it back a little until it's not been included in the photo. You'll be able to see the flare disappear from the image as you prevent the sun from shining onto the lens.
Lens hoods are designed to shield the lens for us and are one of the most underrated pieces of photo equipment. Too many photographers don't use the lens hoods, so don't leave these at home or in your bag. There's no downside whatsoever to use your lens hood, only positives.
Firstly, they reduce peripheral light from entering the lens. This will reduce the chance of lens flare, particularly ghost flare, by rendering deeper and richer shadows. Basically, you'll get better contrast with a lens hood than the same photo taken without a lens hood, even when not shooting into the light.
Secondly, these are the best protector for your lens. Many people use UV or sunlight screw-in filters for protection, but these are far better. If I drop my lens or camera without a lens hood attached, it's not going to end well when it hits the rock at my feet. If I have a UV filter in place, this will most likely be smashed and dented, meaning I can't get it off the lens, so the lens is effectively useless. The very thing that we use to protect the lens is now causing the problem. I've seen this so many times. If I drop my camera with a lens hood attached, the hood will take the impact and will probably break, but the camera will most likely be okay. It's cheap to replace a lens hood, so these are by far the best protection for most lenses.
Obviously, we can't shield the sun from our photo if the sun is within our frame, so what can we do? The first thing is to make sure that the front element of our lens is clean. Any dirt or greasy fingerprints will show up like a neon sign when shooting into the light, so keep your glass clean. I can highly recommend the Photography Online lens cloth, available from our online store, link in the description below.
We should also avoid filters where possible. The more glass we have in front of the camera, the more surfaces there are for light to bounce between.
Remove any unnecessary filters, including UV and sunlight ones. Obviously, if you need to use an ND grad or a polarizer to get the desired result, then you just have to accept that these will be increasing your chances of flare. A polarizer won't have any effect when shooting into the light anyway, so unless you're reducing reflections from the foreground, take it off.
Some lenses are better than others at coping with flare, and this has very little to do with the quality of the lens. I've had kit lenses which have coped with flare very well, but I've also had very high-end lenses which seem to attract flare as if it's a special feature of the lens.
If you have a lens which tends to be prone to flare, then you may be able to control this to some degree by experimenting with the aperture size. Depending on where in the lens the flare is being caused, changing the size of the aperture opening may reduce the size of the flare.
Hopefully, armed with this knowledge, the only flares in your life will be the ones around your ankles. Ruth's been seen wearing them recently, so they must be coming back into fashion.
So hopefully that was useful, and hopefully we can encourage Nick to actually come back from Utah soon. Okay, well, in just a moment we'll be looking at the extra control a specialist tilt shift lens provides, but before that we want to say a big thank you to all of our Photography Online supporters. Their support means we don't have to put those annoying adverts everywhere. Making this show is a full-time job and requires a lot of resources, so if you appreciate what we do or want to help improve the show and enable us to do more elaborate things in the future, check out all the supporter options, which start at only $2.99 per month. You probably wouldn't think twice at paying that for a photo magazine, which is pretty much exactly what Photography Online is, except we read it to you. All supporter funds get invested straight back into the show and get you access to extra features such as our PO live show. We'll also soon be announcing a new monthly show, In the Spotlight, where we chat with a pro photographer about their work, something that will be available to all of our supporters, so now is a great time to support us to make better content for you and all photographers out there. Alright, well, if you sometimes struggle with depth of field or getting everything sharp in your photos, this next feature will hopefully be of help.
A few months ago, I did a feature all about lens movements on a large format film camera to show how much control this gives us when it comes to getting as much of our scene sharp or as out of focus as we like. Many of you asked if the same control was possible with a digital camera, and the short answer is, kind of. To show you what is and isn't possible, I need to use both cameras to show you how they compare. Now, I've chosen this scene here because it typifies what most of us are going to experience in a landscape situation, where we have the foreground at the bottom of the frame, our middle distance in the center of the frame, and our background, which in this case is our mountains, but is often the sky, at the top of the frame. Now, set up as they are, both of these lenses are replicating what we would normally experience with a non-tilt shift lens, one that 99% of us will find ourselves using most of the time. The limitation with this is that the plane of focus is always parallel to the sensor, meaning that as we adjust the focus, all we do is move that plane of focus closer and further away from the camera. The closer to the camera, the thinner the plane of focus. But as we move this further away, it automatically becomes thicker. Everything that comes into contact with our plane of focus will be technically sharp, although not necessarily optically sharp. There are a number of reasons why something that's technically sharp might not be optically sharp. such as diffraction caused by the use of a small aperture, camera movement, subject movement, or even atmospheric conditions. We'll do a feature about getting things optically sharp another time, but today we're focusing, pun intended, on getting things technically sharp. Lens movements give us amazing control over focus by allowing us to tilt or twist the plane of focus so that rather than always being parallel to the sensor, and therefore potentially only covering a small portion of our scene, we can lay it at an angle so that it covers far more or even all of our scene. When we use a standard lens, and by standard I mean one that doesn't have any movements on it, we tend to have to use a very small aperture in order to give the illusion that everything from front to back is pin sharp. But there are a couple of problems with this. Firstly, when we use such small apertures, we experience something called diffraction, which takes the edge off of the entire photo. Secondly, by closing down the aperture, we're not actually making the outer focus areas technically sharp, we're just making them less out of focus. Only objects in contact with our plane of focus will ever be technically sharp. This can become evident if we enlarge an image to a great degree, print it big, or view it from an extreme close distance. In essence, it may appear optically sharp at lower magnifications, but if it's not technically sharp, this will become obvious as we enlarge the photo. By using lens movements to lay the plane of focus over all the key areas in our scene, we can potentially get everything technically sharp, from about a meter in front of the camera right up to infinity, maybe many miles away, even if we're using a wide aperture. This then allows us to use an aperture where the lens is working at its absolute best, meaning that we avoid diffraction and end up with a much sharper image. So let's look at this in practice and see how a digital camera with a tilt-shift lens compares to a large format camera which has both front and back movements. Now it should be said that different tilt-shift lenses from different manufacturers will all operate in a slightly different manner. This one here is a Canon 24mm Mark II, which gives amazing control over all the various movements for reasons which we'll see in a moment. Many people think of tilt-shift lenses as something architectural photographers use, and although they do, they would only typically make use of the shift element, not the tilt element, which is the part which gives us control over focus. The shift element is where we move the lens left or right. On this large format camera, it's actually the back which has the shift movement. On the digital tilt-shift lens, it looks like this. Basically, the same thing, which will achieve the same result. The image moves left and right. On a large format camera, we can also move the lens up and down, something known as rise and fall. But this too can be achieved with a tilt-shift lens on a digital camera, simply by rotating the lens through 90 degrees and applying the same movement we did when we moved it left and right. The image now moves up and down without having to move the camera, ensuring the building remains undistorted. Compare this to how it would look if I had to tilt the camera up rather than the lens. The building now appears to be falling over backwards. With a large format camera, we can apply both shift and rise or fall at the same time. With some tilt-shift lenses, we can do this also by rotating the lens so that it's partially between the horizontal and vertical positions. The more towards the horizontal we move it, the larger the proportion of shift compared to rise we get. So far, this can do everything that this can do, but let's continue and look at the tilt aspect. As mentioned earlier, tilting the lens downwards simply allows us to lay the plane of focus over more of our scene, allowing us to get near and far subjects on the same plane, something which just isn't possible on a standard lens. Using a tilt-shift lens to focus is really quite simple. As far as I know, they're all manual focus. This one certainly is. So you need to activate the live view and use the screen on the back of the camera. It's probably not going to work if you try and use the viewfinder. So all we're going to do is we're going to magnify the center, the very center of the image. Doesn't matter whether that's where your subject is or not. So I'm going to place the magnifying box over the center of the image and zoom in. Now, all I need to do is focus the middle of the image. And if I come down to the bottom of the image, we can see that that's very, very out of focus. But I don't want to touch the focus point now because we're focused on the middle of the scene. In order to focus the bottom, I'm going to apply some forward tilt. So I'm just going to tilt the lens until that bottom bit becomes sharp. And there we go. So now, if we zoom back to the middle, that's still perfectly sharp where we were. And if we go up to the top, you can see that that's also sharp. So what we've essentially done is we've achieved front to back sharpness by laying the plane of focus forward so it covers the entire landscape, even though we're at f3.5. In addition to tilting the lens forwards and backwards, we can also swing it left and right, which on a large format camera looks like this. But we can do exactly the same with our tilt shift lens. All we need to do is twist it through 90 degrees, and what was tilting forwards and backwards is now swinging left and right. Now this is really useful if you want to shoot down a wall and align the plane of focus so it goes right down the wall to get everything sharp. If we already have some rise, fall or shift dialed in, when we rotate the lens to change the tilt into swing, you would think that we would also have to rotate the shift element, therefore upsetting whatever effect it was achieving. But this particular tilt shift lens allows each control to be rotated independently, something which many others do not allow. So be aware of this before making any purchases. The real beneficiary of the tilt element is the landscape photographer. So it's surprising that more landscapers don't have one of these in their bag. Many large format cameras also have rear standard movements, which allow even more control over both focus and perspective. So if you see me using a large format camera on a future episode of Photography Online, and believe me, you will, then don't think that any of the lens movements that I'm showing you don't apply to you just because you have a digital camera. Get yourself a tilt shift lens and you can join in the fun and get control over your photography that you never knew was possible. No longer will you be limited with your depth of field, and you'll never have buildings falling over backwards or lampposts leaning into frame. A tilt shift lens is a great addition to any landscape or architectural photographer's bag, so check out what's available for your branded camera. You'll soon be able to control depth of field like never before, ensuring your entire scene from front to back is pin sharp, even when using your widest apertures. Now there are caveats to this, and it's dependent on the scene that you're shooting, and we'll be looking at those on future large format features, so make sure you join me for that.
Thanks, Marcus, but don't go too far as we'll be meeting you again later on in the show. Now, another way to increase your depth of field is to focus stack. We'll be looking at how to do this as well as how not to do it in our next show, so watch out for that. If you saw our previous show, I was in an amazing medieval town in the heart of Spain, co-leading our annual trip there. Many of you have been in touch to request details of next year's trip, so we hope to see some of you then. If you want details of that trip as well as all the others we do, along with a few articles on photography written by the team and a couple of our regular customers, then I can highly recommend our annual magazine Off the Beaten Track. Priced at only £2.50, it's available in both hard copy or a PDF version. Obviously, you don't need to pay for postage on the PDF version, but personally I enjoy having physical pages to turn, and there is a link to both in the usual place. Okay, well, one of the areas that we know you're really interested in is how to get the best quality images. Lenses are a key part of this, but regardless of the standard of lens you use, there are a few tips that you can apply to ensure it's performing at its very best, even on a budget kit lens. Here's Harry to tell us more.
When it comes to the quality of our images, there are a number of factors which can have an influence, but none more so than with our lens. Lenses come in all shapes and sizes, with focal length being the main difference, but other variables would include aperture range and closest focus distance. Regardless of what lens you have, whether it be an entry-level zoom or a Pro Spec Prime, there are certain things we can do to make sure we're getting the very best out of our lenses. While we would expect a Pro lens used at its optimum settings to be better than a kit lens used at its optimum settings, it would be perfectly possible for a kit lens to outperform a Pro lens if the Pro lens was used poorly and the kit lens used wisely. But what do I mean by used poorly and wisely? Well, let's start by looking at a zoom lens, as this is probably the most common type of lens used. Zoom lenses have two variables, focal length and aperture. Within each of these variables, there will be areas where the lens performs at its very best, and others where it performs less favourably. If we combine two of the poorer settings, we will get a noticeable degradation in the resulting image. Let's do some tests to see how this plays out in reality. The further from the centre of a lens, the weaker the image. So I'm going to position this stone tower right in the corner, where any difference in a lens will be more noticeable. Starting with my 24 to 105mm lens in the sweet spot of its focal range and its aperture range, the cross on the tower looks like this. Pretty good considering we are only looking at a tiny area of the photo. Now let's open up the aperture to the maximum of this lens, f4, and as we would expect, there's a subtle drop off in sharpness. And the same shot, but this time at the smallest aperture of f22, where diffraction is noticeable but not horrendous. Here are all three versions to compare. Now let's do the same again, but at the lens's shortest focal length. Immediately we can see these are not as good as they were in the middle of the focal range, but as expected, the f8 version is the cleanest. And finally, the long end, which shows a massive difference between f4 and f8. But unsurprisingly, this shot, taken at the lens's sweet spot, is the best of the bunch. Here are all 9 versions, with the corner ones being where the lens was used at two of its weaker settings, where sharpness and contrast are suffering. So if you have a zoom lens, I'm not saying never use it at the extreme focal lengths, but if you do, try not to use it along with an extreme aperture, as the two together will be quite noticeable. If you have more than one lens, then they may overlap in their focal ranges. For example, if you have a 24 to 105 and a 70 to 200, then these overlap in the 70 to 105mm regions. If they're of the same quality, however, then rather than using the 24 to 105 right at its extreme long end, we'd be better off using the 70 to 200 at 105mm, as this is more likely to be working optimally at that range. When it comes to prime lenses, these are always working at their optimum focal length, as this is fixed. The only variable is the aperture range, so while it's more difficult to use a prime lens poorly, you're still going to get better results if you use the lens at its sweet spot. This is usually 2 to 3 stops down from a lens's maximum aperture. So for example, for an f1.4 lens, it's likely to be singing in the region of f2.8 to f4. If, however, you've got an f5.6 lens, it's more likely to be dancing at f11. Regardless of whether we use a zoom lens or a prime lens, we experience different problems depending on which end of the aperture range we use the lenses at. For example, if we use them at the widest end of the aperture range, then we should expect to see the edges of the image suffer a little with both detail and luminance. This is often seen as a drop-off in brightness in the corners of the shot. However, if you are taking portraits, then the edges of your photo probably aren't going to be sharp anyway, and you could argue that the natural vignetting actually helps the shot. So in this example, don't be afraid to use your lens wide open. Where you don't want to use it wide open is in a landscape situation where you want corner-to-corner sharpness, as this won't give you the results you are hoping for. If we use a lens at the smallest end of the aperture range, then we enter the world of diffraction. We did a feature on this in this show here, so check that out if you'd like to know more. Diffraction will take the sharpness off the entire image, not just at the edges, so this is something you really should avoid. Unless you have a very good reason to use the lens at its smallest aperture, this will never give you the best results. Another way to make sure your lens is performing optimally is to make sure that you haven't got any filters attached to the front of it unnecessarily. Many people have skylight or UV filters permanently fitted to their lens, under the pretense that it protects the front element. In reality, a lens hood will provide far more protection, so use this rather than adding an extra piece of glass for the light to have to travel through. Only use a filter such as a polarizer or a neutral density if the effect it gives you outweighs the quality it's going to remove from the resulting image. If you use the highest quality filters, then degradation is unlikely to be noticeable, but making lots of small changes like cleaning the front and rear elements not using unnecessary filters, and trying to use the optimum settings where possible, then you should find that your photos are slapping you around the face with sharpness, contrast, and detail. If not, then it's probably time to upgrade your lens. Sorry about that.
If you'd like access to more information like that, then check out these 2 volumes of Essential Camera Skills, containing everything that we covered on the show during the first couple of years. They provide all the details about everything you're likely to need to know in order to get great photos. Priced at just £12.50, there's a link in the usual place below. Now, photography has been around for a long time, and in some areas it has changed enormously, but in other areas it is still similar to how it was during the last century. As this is a lens-themed show, we thought we'd compare a vintage lens with a modern-day equivalent to see just how far lens performance has come. Get ready, because we're about to time travel back to the 70s.
We all know how far technology has come over the past 50 years, and most of these advancements, certainly in terms of photography, has been in the camera bodies, with things like digital capture and autofocus being the obvious ones which wouldn't have been around when this lens was made. So what is this lens? Well, it's a Minolta Rockall 58mm f1.2. This one is from the same year that Neil Armstrong landed on the moon, and it was considered at the time to be one of the very best optics on the market. But how does it stand up to an equivalent lens of today? We're about to find out. This lens is a bit of a rarity in that it's a 50-year-old Minolta lens in great condition, which has been modified with a Canon EF mount, meaning that it will fit almost any Canon camera. But why have I gone out and bought one of these when I've already got a high quality modern day equivalent? It's a good question, and one I hope to answer in the next few minutes. Now I'm going to shoot this scene here with both lenses at f2, f5.6 and f11 to see what difference there is. Now I'm expecting the Sigma to walk all over this, but we shall see. There are 2 main purposes for a lens of this focal length: landscapes and portraits. Landscapes would typically require the use of small apertures to increase the depth of field. So a super fast prime like this is a bit of an overkill in this area. So it's really a portrait lens, with the standard focal length giving us a very natural perspective and an area where we can utilise the fast apertures. So this is where we'll spend most of our time on this comparison. But first, let's just go and take a landscape shot and get it out of our system. Because this is a very contrasty scene looking into the sun, I'm not sure how much detail we're going to be able to compare apart from the very edges of all the rocks. So I'm just going to swing around and use the old hotel down here, which is obviously going to have a lot more detail to pull out. So I'm manually focusing both lenses because obviously the other one is only manual focus. So here's the full scene taken on the Sigma lens at f5.6. As you can see, there's a small specular flare here, but other than this, it's a very clean and sharp image. And here's the f5.6 version from the Minolta lens. The immediate observation is that this shot instantly looks retro. We have a much larger area of flare going on here, and the colours seem to be much warmer in that style which only the 1970s could provide. The sharpness looks good at this resolution, but let's zoom in to 100% on each of the 3 versions to see exactly what difference there is. With the Minolta being 8mm longer in focal length, it obviously provides a larger magnification. But the other obvious difference is that shift in colour balance, with the Sigma being more neutral, although you could easily put a case forward for the warmer colours of the Minolta being more desirable in this situation. The Sigma does have more contrast in all 3 versions, due to the lack of flare which the Minolta is having by shooting directly into the light. In terms of sharpness, to my eyes at least, I would say the Sigma appears slightly sharper at f2. Then there's nothing between them at f5.6, and then the Sigma just edges it again at f11. But there really isn't much in it, and I'm having to look really hard to find the differences, something which is surprising to me. Taking a quick look at the hotel photos, where we are no longer shooting into the light, once again, the Sigma looks sharper at f2, but I really can't split them at f5.6 or f11. The contrast of the Minolta is better than it was, but still not as good as the Sigma, and the overall exposures are very slightly darker. This may be to do with a slight misalignment between the apertures on the lenses, or it could be that the Minolta shots were taken after the Sigma ones in fading light. So far, it's a point, albeit a minor one, in favour of the modern lens. But let's use these lenses for what they were really designed for, portraits. So after we've done the landscapes, now I'm going to do the portrait. So we have our beautiful model here, Cloudy, and we've got her sitting in the shade. And then you probably can't see it on camera, but we've got a reflector way over there in the sunlight. So it's bouncing light back onto Cloudy here. So you can see that she's got this nice directional light. Now that's completely irrelevant to the task at hand, but just in case you were wondering. So I'm going to take some portrait shots using the Sigma 50mm f1.4 art lens to start with. I'm going to use it at f2. I'm going to use the other lens at f2 just so it's a fairly good comparison, but I might shoot some wide open on this, which is f1.4, and shoot some wide open on that, which is f1.2, just to see what the results are like, but it's not fair to compare them 1.2 to 1.4. So we'll just start by taking some nice kind of head and shoulder portraits here. The beauty of this lens is obviously I've got autofocus, whereas with the other lens it's purely manual focus. So it'll be much easier to do everything on this lens than it will on the other lens, but that's my problem, not yours. So as always with portraits, always get down to eye level. So I'm just gonna lower myself there, focusing on the eye, and just gonna take a couple of test shots just to make sure my exposure's okay. Now I'm blowing out the background because that's bright sunlight, but that's obviously not a problem. Just going to come a tiny bit closer. Okay, so eyes back towards the camera. So I've just softened the light a little bit because the first ones were like this. They were just a bit too harsh and a bit shiny. So we've softened the light, so just so you know that that's with zero reflector. That's how we've just had it, and that's how it was before. So that's too much there. That's not enough, and that's pretty good. So it looks nice and natural. So all we're going to do now is just pick one at random and go in and check the sharpness. But because this is an autofocus lens, you can see that it's nice and sharp. It's not going to be that easy with the manual focus, so I'm going to have to adopt a few focusing techniques. So you can see the size comparison. The old lens is much smaller, but although it's also lighter, it's not as light as it looks because this is pretty much solid glass. So that will fit onto there. Because we're working at f2 here, and this is a slightly longer focal length than the other lens, so our depth of field is going to be literally a couple of millimeters. So I can't possibly see that much detail through the viewfinder. I could set the camera up on a tripod and magnify the live view and focus it manually there, but that assumes that Cloud is not going to be moving as well, which he probably is, so that's not going to work. So what I'm going to do is once I think I've got the right focus point, I'm just going to take a burst of photos and just gently bracket the distance between the camera, and then hopefully we'll get one that's sharp. So let's just try that. So exactly the same as we were before. So another method I can do is I can do exactly the same, but I can keep still and I can just rock the lens barrel very slightly backwards and forwards. So we'll just try that technique in case it's any better. So same again. So we've got some nice little breeze blowing now, and it's just taking the hair off the shoulders, which is always a bonus. Nothing to do with the lens, of course, but so with this lens I'm having to take a lot more photos because I just have to accept that because I'm working with such a shallow depth of field, 80% of them are probably not going to be sharp. So I really need to take 5 times the amount of photos on this lens as with the other lens. So that's definitely a tick in the box for modern technology. So let's just check those and check the sharpness. So I'm just flicking through some here. You see that's obviously well out of focus. That's a blink and out of focus. That's a little bit sharper but still not sharp. And that's pin sharp there. So you're not going to get it any better than that, I don't think, and that one as well. So obviously as I've bracketed, I've gone through the plane of focus perfectly there. So these ones are all well out of focus and you can see it's getting sharper, sharper, that's sharp, and then we start losing it again on the other side. So we've got a good example now of this lens at f2 and the other lens at f2. So what I'm going to do now is I'm just going to change this lens to 1.2. Obviously we can't do that on the Sigma, but we shot the Sigma at 1.4 wide open. So we're going to shoot this at wide open as well, just to see what the difference is. So now I'm at f1.2, which means an even shallower depth of field. So it makes my job even more difficult. So we'll just go for it and see what happens, I think. I've got 50 years of technology working against me here, so just need to be a bit patient. There's one there that's absolutely pin sharp and you're blinking. It's because you knew. If you look at the outer focus areas, we'll bring it up on the screen here, it's unbeatable. What we want to try and do is get one where your hair's lifted up, you've got a good expression, and I've managed to get it sharp. Light's good. Just need that little bit of breeze to lift the hair off your face now. Right, let's have a go, look at that. How does the light look on me at the moment? Is it okay?
Oh, it's amazing.
You see this eye's in shadow at the moment, but then as soon as you look back towards the light, it comes alive.
Yeah.
Because if you're looking straight at the camera, if one eye is sharp, the other one should be sharp. See, that eye's very slightly soft than that eye. That shows you how shallow the depth of field is, because if you look there, you're looking almost directly at the camera, unless you've got one eye further back into your head than the other.
Don't think so.
It's a sign of local inbreeding.
So these are the 2 shots taken at f2 side by side. Nothing has been done to these apart from a slight lifting of the shadows and a reduction of the highlights to flatten them out a little. But the same adjustments have been applied to both. At this magnification, the winner in my eyes is the Minolta all day long. Its warmer tones and softer feel make it ideal for close-up portraits like this. But let's zoom in to 100% to see how they differ on a pixel level. For me, there's no change. I still prefer the Minolta lens, for the Sigma is just too sharp and shows every pore in the model's face, something we will then have to soften in post-production. The 1960s have done this naturally with the Minolta lens, providing a much more pleasant result. Now let's look at both lenses wide open. As I mentioned, this is not really a fair comparison, as the Minolta is f1.2 and the Sigma is f1.4. But the big difference is in the bokeh of the background, with the Minolta walking all over the Sigma. One of the reasons it's also known as the bokeh beast. Zooming into 100% shows that the Sigma doesn't really lose any of its sharpness wide open, whereas the Minolta does have a noticeable fall off from what it was at f2. But it's still working favourably for this kind of close-up portrait.
So there you have it. The answer to the question, how far have lenses come in the past 50 years? Not that far. While the Sigma is definitely sharper, there really isn't that much in it. The vintage lens, unsurprisingly, gives that vintage feel. So if you don't want your photos to look super clinical and, dare I say it, digital, this could be the answer. Plus, if you use one of these, you'll look super cool. What? Why are you laughing?
We often use that lens for recording my sections of the show, including this one that you're watching now, as it's compact, super fast and manual focus, meaning it never tries to hunt when I turn away, for example. It is amazing to think that with all the modern technology that we have, that we're still using something made in the 1960s, because there's nothing better available for a comparable price. So if you think I look a bit rough on this lens, then you should see me on a modern one. Also, rumour has it that the lens that you just saw Marcus using is actually radioactive. Apparently, Minolta used thorium dioxide for the rear element coating, which might explain why Marcus looks the way he does. If you're interested in that, Google radioactive lens to find out more. Okay, so at the beginning of the show, I asked which of these exposures would give the brightest image at ISO 100. A, 1/60th at f/16, B, 1/30th at f/8, C, 1/500th at f/1.4, or D, 1/250th at f/5.6. If you said B, then you were wrong. The correct answer was in fact C, 1/500th at f/1.4, which is 5 stops brighter than A, 1 stop brighter than B, and 3 stops brighter than D. So well done if you worked that out correctly. So sadly we're out of time again, but don't go quite yet, because I want to tell you what you can look forward to on the next show. Marcus is still exploring gear from 50 years ago. This time it's film, which expired in 1975. Does it still work, and how will the results look? Find out next time, along with how to shoot great dolphin photos if you don't like going on boats, and we'll be giving you our start to finish guide to focus stacking. That's all coming up in just a couple of weeks, so make sure that you join me for that. Until then, take good care, but most of all, take good photos.
As a large format camera would, but it's still really, really good. No, really, really good. What am I talking about?
I've forgotten the start.
No, take 2.
The more surfaces there are, surfaces there are.
Rather than using the 24 to 105, God's sake. Blah, 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 blah.
Which has been modified to have a Canon. Can't even turn the bloody thing off. Right, there we go.
For an f1.4 lens, it's going to be singing, dancing.
Which seem to attract flare, as if it's a special feature of the lens.
I've forgotten the start again, for God's sake. It's about this paragraph, the only variable.
With this lens, we can control tilt, swing, rise, and shift.
2 to 3 stops down from its maximum aperture. I've forgotten the rest.
It's a good answer, and one I hope to answer. I actually look quite good like this, you know.